Externalities is a very interesting subject, and if you want to learn a little bit more about it, I suggest watching a very short clip from The Corporation, which is a documentary. So you only have to type in The Corporation and Externalities on YouTube, and you'll have a 3-minute clip going over externalities. Essentially, what an externality is when you consume a certain good or when you produce a certain good, you have a certain value attached to it for your own consumption, for the reason why you're doing this. But the externality is the positive or negative effect that you may have on people surrounding you by consuming this good. So an example is if you smoke, well, when you're thinking about smoking a cigarette by yourself at home, well, if you're smoking the cigarette, normally if you're there by yourself, you just take into account the cost of your cigarette, maybe the different costs associated to cleaning up the house or something else from the smell if you want to reduce the smell. And otherwise, the cost on your own health, and you take into account the benefits that you get from it, and you decide how many cigarettes you will smoke based on that relationship between the two. If you get more benefit from smoking an extra cigarette than the cost that you get, you will smoke that extra cigarette. If you don't, you won't. That's how a typical private individual will base his decision. But as soon as you introduce other people in the room, well, then this person may still be thinking about himself only. But if you start thinking about the others, well, then you see that you're causing a negative externality on other people. The more you smoke, the more you fill up the room with smoke, the more you hurt other people's health and well-being from being around you. So that's the negative externality. Typically people, unless you care about these people around you, you just take into account your own benefits. Same thing as if you decide to make a really nice garden at your home. Well, essentially you're doing this for yourself, but the people around you will appreciate it. They'll appreciate it because they're going to have a beautiful site. It won't be a dumpster or an old car breaking down and hanging around in your lawn. It's going to be this beautiful site. So it's a positive externality. At the same time, you can think about installing a sprinkler system if you're in this condominium in Montreal. Well, by installing a sprinkler system, you're causing a positive externality on others. The reason why you're doing so is that if ever there's a fire in your place, well, hopefully the sprinkler system will kill the fire really quickly, or having just a good fire detection system, hopefully you're going to stop the fire before it gets too late. But when you have a sprinkler system, essentially you're actually helping your neighbors a lot as well, because if you're in a kind of a townhouse type setting, well, probably even if the fire started at your neighbor's, it's not going to be able to cross over your house to the next neighbor because you have this really in-depth system in place. So it's helping yourself out, but it's also helping others. So how is this going to influence the situation here? Okay. Well, the cost to produce a certain good or the cost to yourself may be different than the social cost when we have these externalities. So let's just go through an example. Okay. So let's say a firm produces some goods by running a factory, but it's also at the same time it's either releasing carbon emissions or it's releasing pollutants in the river or different things like that. So it's also releasing pollution as a byproduct. The firm makes its decision based on its marginal cost and marginal revenue, and it's going to set its marginal private cost, which is referred to here as MC with a low p, equal to the marginal benefit. So we're going to have a situation as such. Okay. So here, similar to before, price or dollar sign up here, quantity down here. And here, just to kind of switch it up a little bit, we're going to use marginal, that should be MB, marginal benefit as our kind of a demand curve, because we know that the demand curve represented willingness to pay, or that This is the additional benefit for an extra unit. My marginal willingness to pay drops down the more I get of that good, cigarettes or whatever else it is. Okay, and we said the marginal cost of production and the supply curve are linked. Okay, but here we're just going to note that this is the marginal private cost of production. So this would be our initial situation, and the firm would decide to produce this quantity Q star worth of output. Okay, so this would be in the situation where we have free markets. This would be my quantity. Okay, well, now that we know that this production leads to a certain level of externalities, what's that going to do? Well, we have this private cost, but we know that there's also pollution. So we need to take into account what's the extra cost of pollution. Well, here for a certain quantity, we could think this is the cost that the firm bears in terms of materials bought and everything else. But we have to add an additional cost. Even for this quantity here, we have to add an additional cost. So if we were to add this additional cost, we could think this is our marginal cost of social, which is equal to the marginal cost for the private firm plus the externality, which in this case is negative. It's a negative externality. It's an extra cost. So this distance here would be my externality. So what's going to happen with this? Well, this is what the free market would have produced. But if I look at the total cost for society versus the benefits to society, if I compare the marginal cost to the marginal benefits, I would now see that my social optimal, so this is my social optimal or my allocatively efficient level of production. So this will be referred to as allocative efficiency. Okay, this is the quantity I should be producing. And this makes sense. When you think about it, if you think of that cigarette smoker that we had a second ago, he's smoking a cigarette and doesn't really care about people around him. All of a sudden we realize that secondhand smoke is very dangerous. There's people around him. Those people are his friends. So even though he would consume a larger quantity, Q star, if he was by himself and not taking into account the externality on other people, as soon as other people come in, well, he should be consuming less, because at the quantity that he used to consume, he was over-consuming, or here in the case of a firm that we had here is that the free market overproduces. Because we should restrict our output because of this negative externality. Okay. So we'll see how we could do that in a second. On the other hand, we may have a positive production externality. So in the case of the sprinkler system, or if this company releases a new technology and it's actually spilling over to other companies afterwards, it's beneficial for more companies out there. Well, then you have a situation where they have their marginal benefits and their marginal costs of producing these goods. But in this case here, if I think back to this example that we had here, if the externality would actually be good for society, we would be saying that the costs would be kind of minimized. We'd be moving on to the other side. And based on that, we would notice that we're underproducing in the case of this technology, because we're not taking into account all of these positive spillovers. We're only taking into account the positive benefits and costs to this firm itself. So when we think of things that spill over to other people, we want to encourage that as much as possible, because if we don't encourage it, we might have underproduction. So if we think of fire systems, well, then you might have certain laws in place that requires that everyone has a good fire detection system, because we know that it has positive spillovers. So even if some people might not do it on their own, if they're mandated to do it, it's going to be best for society. What are the ways that we could adjust for these positive and negative externalities to achieve the right efficient level So here, the efficient level, I'm talking about the socially optimal level. Because in the past, efficiency was really where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, because we thought that all costs were taken into account. What we're noticing in this chapter here is that maybe the private costs, marginal costs, do not encompass all the costs involved. So because of that, we want to achieve the socially optimal situation where we do include all the costs. And if it's in the case of a positive externality, we want to take into account that positive part that happens. So what can we do? Go through this relatively fast, but this is private negotiation is because of this famous article written by Coase, which discusses this idea that as soon as you have one of the two people has kind of like this property rights, we could either pay one individual or the other individual could pay the other individual to make them behave in a certain way. So if you're allowed to make loud noise in your apartment, but your neighbor doesn't like that, well, your neighbor could pay you for you to reduce the noise level to a certain extent. Or if you're allowed to smoke in a room and your friend doesn't like it, he could pay you for you to reduce smoke consumption. Or it could be the other way around. Maybe you're not allowed to smoke and your friend doesn't like you to smoke, but you kind of convince him, let me smoke one and I'll pay you this amount of money. So through private negotiation, it might be possible to achieve something that's close to this socially optimal level. The problem with this private negotiation is that it's easy when you have a limited amount of people in this transaction, a low amount of people negotiating. When you're dealing with climate change and carbon emissions, there's just too many players. You can't go through that. Government regulations would be to maybe install certain standards, or saying that you cannot use you cannot use coal-fired power plants or something else because it produced too many emissions. There's just too much pollution coming out, or it could be banning the use of CFCs or something else. Those would be government regulations. On the other hand, you might have Piccovian taxes and subsidies. This is named after a famous economist named Pigou. And essentially it's a tax or a subsidy to correct for the negative or positive externality. So you have this situation where you are trying to convince or trying to bring people to consume the right amount that would be socially optimal. So if we go back to this example that we had a second ago, over here, in this situation here, if I were to implement a tax wedge of this amount, and this is one of the reasons why we covered chapter 18 before covering chapter 16, if this was a tax amount per unit tax. Well, in this situation here, we saw that when we introduce a tax, we would effectively reduce the quantity exchange, and it would reduce down to this quantity here, which is socially optimal. So this is a tax which is essentially used to correct. So a corrective tax. And in this case here, this corrective tax is going to the socially optimal situation. So we could think that there was a loss to society beforehand. We won't focus on drawing that weight loss in this case, but there was a loss to society beforehand because we weren't producing the right quantity. And now because of this corrective tax, we actually are, which is better for society. So a tax may sometimes be used and may sometimes not lead to that weight loss because we're actually not going away from the efficient quantity of production, but going to the socially optimal one, the new efficient one. Okay. And if it was a case of a positive externality, it would simply be a subsidy. So by introducing a subsidy, you would have this situation that you would produce more because you're subsidizing it, and you'd have a situation where the marginal cost of these every unit produced would be lower because they receive a subsidy for every unit produced, and therefore we would achieve a point where we do produce a larger quantity. Okay. So those are our main tools. So with negative production externalities, we introduce a tax. With positive production externalities, we can introduce a subsidy. The big last comment I can make about this subject that makes it tricky is practicality. How much the tax, when we're trying to solve for an externality, may be hard to measure the marginal benefits and the marginal costs of society and these externalities and stuff like that. How much do every unit of carbon emissions actually bring and damage to society? It's hard to measure, but over time, if you introduce carbon taxes and everything, you might start getting a feel of the benefit to society and the actual cost of society. So this is one of the challenges, is to determine the right tax amount, but it's definitely something that's doable.